All right, welcome to another edition of our YouTube discussion that we've been having once a week here every Friday. We like to take some of your questions. You know, on television, we call it Your Take. Here on YouTube, we just are so grateful that you're here. Any questions that you have about this latest COVID surge that seems to have ended as of now, or at least it's going down, let us know your questions about the pandemic, about what you're thinking. Joining us now is a very special guest of ours, Dr. Justin Skrzynski with Beaumont Health, and it's always good to see you. Dr. Skrzynski, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to join.
So I wanted to ask you just right off the bat, as we take a look at today, we noticed in the last week and a half, the last 10 days, every day we're on TV at 5 o'clock and we're saying, look, the numbers have gone down yet again. I think the last I checked, the positivity rate in the state of Michigan was close to 10%. Give us an idea, a snapshot of what things look like today.
Yeah, as you said, very good news coming out of the past week or so. That percent positivity keeps falling. At the height of things with Omicron, we saw that ridiculously high, 20, 25%, whereas during previous surges, we considered the teens to be high. So in terms of that incidence of COVID falling in the community, numbers are falling. Most importantly, hospitalizations and deaths are falling dramatically too. So in the hospital, for instance, we see our COVID volume way down. For instance, at Royal Oak, that's where I am. At the peak, we saw about maybe 250 COVID patients hospitalized, and now we're down to 50 to 60. So a huge decrease, definitely cause for optimism.
No, that is true, and I think a lot of people are feeling that optimism. But we also remember, after Delta, before Omicron, there was that feeling of relief that so many people got burned by, where everyone said, "Hey, we don't have to wear a mask anymore," and then all of a sudden, I think it was within 3 or 4 days, we were right back at it. Why is this different?
Well, right now, so much of the population has either been vaccinated or exposed to Omicron or both. And so right now, what we're thinking is that there's a lot of immunity that exists in our community right now. And as such, you'd probably need a radically new variant in order to create a new surge. So you can't just have something that might be a little bit different than Omicron. We can talk about that BA2 variant. That's what a lot of people are hearing about right now. But in order to really create a new surge, you'd have to have something very dramatically different from Omicron. So very possible to happen. Hopefully it won't. If you remember when Omicron became a variant of interest compared to when it was the dominant strain, very rapid. That was within a month. So it's certainly possible for something new to break onto the scene, but we're hoping that's not going to happen.
And one of the reasons that it isn't as likely to happen as it was before was because of the vaccination. Talk a little bit about that for a moment.
Yeah, so, you want to pick one of the most controversial things of the past couple of years. But at the same time, the vaccination, especially plus the booster, that's really the key point, is plus the booster. That seems to be very effective in preventing hospitalizations from Omicron. Now, it's not necessarily to prevent symptomatic disease. If you go back to the very beginning, remember this vaccine was designed against the original strain of COVID that we had. At that point, we were saying, something like 95% protection against symptomatic infection, outstanding. Now the numbers that we're seeing, perhaps something like 70 to 75% in terms of preventing hospitalization from Omicron, that's still very excellent protection in terms of preventing the worst outcomes.
All right, we're getting questions pouring in on my Twitter page, on the Facebook page, and live right here on YouTube as well. I want to take a question from his name. I always love the titles because, you can have fun with it, right? This person's name is Just Some Guy. We think you're more than just some guy because you have a great question here. We have Just Some Guy asking the question, Dr. Skrzynski, what are your thoughts on, I think he means hydroxychloroquine, which is always hard to spell for anybody, and I totally understand you there, my man, and ivermectin. What are your thoughts on those two? Here we are now months after we first heard those words.
Right. So right now, and those are two, again, of the really hot button ones you see, a lot of people, especially big media figures. I know Joe Rogan was recently in the news for all the controversy regarding other comments he made. We won't touch those, but in terms of the COVID comments that he made, big proponent of ivermectin. The point is that, with ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, there's never been any conclusive evidence that they work. So there's really no mechanism by which they work. There's been no study that shows definitively that they work. And there's a much larger number of studies that show that it basically does nothing. Now, in terms of ivermectin, for instance, you have to differentiate between what we see in the lab and what we see in people. So a lot of the times people point to what we call in vitro studies. Those are our lab studies. And so if you take these viral cultures, you have cells and you see if COVID can multiply in that, and you flood that with ivermectin, you flood that with hydroxychloroquine. This is kind of a kitchen sink approach, and we just want to see what sticks. In high concentrations, yeah, we see that this decreases viral replication. So that, oh, wow, we're onto something. But, when we try it out in people, we actually give therapeutic doses. It doesn't do anything. And if you look at the doses that were required to inhibit viral replication in the lab, in the test tubes, they're basically toxic concentrations. So you can't give a person enough ivermectin to prevent COVID from multiplying without killing them. So, it's one of those things where a lot of people even say, and this is, that's a separate issue, but people will say, well, it's my right to try, or, it's my right to say, if I want to take this medication, I will risk that it does nothing. I will risk that it will give me side effects because I believe it'll work. It's a very controversial issue, but the point is that you got to find a doctor that agrees with you. You certainly can't leverage that to try and strong arm anybody to prescribe that for you.
Do you think there's, in many ways, and I know that you got to speak on the line here, you're representing Beaumont and that's your employer, and I get that. I just want to ask you, there's a lot of people in different worlds of medicine out there, right? I mean, you have people who are, homeopathic medication people, you have people who are these alternative medicine people, and it seems like there's different groups saying different things. Is there any place where all of the doctors agree on whether it be diet or supplements or vitamins?
Well, I mean, the thing that we can all agree on is to have been healthy by the time you get exposed to COVID. A lot of people say, well, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm low risk. Yeah, those things are certainly true. If you look at if you want to play the numbers, if you're a young, healthy person, chances are you won't really develop a severe illness from COVID. But I've seen people who have. I've seen very healthy young people who have died from COVID. So it's certainly possible. And the counterpoint to that, you might say, well, as a young, healthy person, you might die of any number of things. True, but still, if you have something that can mitigate that risk, so much the better. The problem is that, supplements, things like vitamin D, that's one that comes up a lot. Certainly beneficial. If you're vitamin D deficient, that can cause a whole number of issues. And, that's certainly something you can supplement. These things are very low risk. So taking a multivitamin is very low risk, for instance. That's not going to prevent COVID. That's not going to cure COVID. From our standpoint in the hospital, the things that the big studies bear out, such as especially steroid therapy, and bear in mind, the steroid that we're talking about, this is not some big pharmaceutical drug. This is a drug that's cheap as dirt. It's been around for decades, called dexamethasone. No one's making a huge profit off of that. Sure. But we can, on the therapeutic side, we can agree about some of these therapies, which not only are borne out in these huge national or international studies, but what we see in the hospital. In terms of the common ground between all the different disciplines, however, I think that healthy living aspect is going to help you not only with COVID, but many diseases.
All right, great points here. We're getting a lot of questions, a lot of comments on the YouTube channel here. I want to read Kawana McCrae. Kawana begins by asking, for a person with high blood pressure, what is the best COVID shot for them? And they go on, and the scrolls happening really quick, so I'm trying to keep up here. I'm asking the doctor, I don't want him to take the wrong shot. Apparently this person has a relative with high blood pressure and wants to know if there's one vaccine that is best for that person. What would you say?
I would recommend either the Pfizer or Moderna shots. I would hold them to be roughly equivalent. If you look at the data, there's going to be some variance in there, but overall, those are the mRNA vaccines. I'd recommend one of those. There really shouldn't be any contraindication for high blood pressure. And in terms of somebody with a chronic illness, that does put you at more risk for COVID. So all the more reason to be vaccinated. But right now, the two shots that we have that seem to be the most beneficial, Pfizer and Moderna.
This person is coming to us on Twitter, and they're saying with Omicron B2, I think it's, is it BA2? Is that how you say that there, Dr. Skrzynski?
Yes.
BA2, now in 47 states, and even being reported as being vaccine resistant. First of all, I want you to clarify whether that's true or not. Secondly, why are mask mandates being lifted? So let's begin with what he says about BA2 in 47 states being reported as being vaccine resistant. Is that true?
Yes, it is. It is true to a degree. And I think it's important to note that the BA2 variant compared to regular Omicron, which is itself many steps removed from the original COVID. So we're talking about variants of variants at this point. There is a degree of I wouldn't call it resistance. I think a more precise word is evasion, because again, it's so different from the original COVID that this immune response that you're creating with the vaccine, your body's not necessarily going to as readily identify it and attack it as it would with previous variants. So there is some escape from that protection with the BA2 variant. One of the interesting things is that if you look at countries where, including our own, where the BA2 variant is sort of burgeoning, you're actually not seeing an increase in hospitalizations. So as BA2 takes over, because it is slightly more contagious, well, I shouldn't say slightly, some estimates say even up 50% more contagious than regular Omicron, which is itself very contagious. It's taking over because of how contagious it is. However, very interesting that it's not creating big spikes in cases. So either, we can conclude that people who have been exposed to Omicron have some degree of protection. And also importantly, that the vaccine is still preventing hospitalizations. So, you might see big case numbers, but if we can keep people from getting critically ill or even just sick enough to land in the hospital, then it's already done its job.
And we've heard, in the past, I think it was about a month and a half ago or so, some reports from, medical journals and doctors who were saying that it looks as though this particular strain, Omicron, could indeed reverse inoculate people from other strains. Is that something that's proven to be true, would you say, or is the jury still out on that?
So far, yes. It looks like in terms of the protection that you get from having been exposed to Omicron, it looks like that is, backwards compatible, you could say, to previous variants. So having Delta didn't really seem to give people too much protection against Omicron. But having Omicron, it seems like those people actually do have good protection against previous variants because we're not seeing those previous variants necessarily flare up at this point.
What about masks? This person's asking the question, why are mask mandates being relaxed? And by the way, and we should be clear, in Michigan, there was no mask mandate per se, but there was definitely a recommendation to wear them. And that was has since been relaxed as of this past week. What are your thoughts on that? Is it too soon? And why do you think the state decided now is a good time?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question of why now is the time that was decided. Personally, I don't agree with it at this point. I think we're very close, and I think it's important for people to hear that. I think because I think many would say, well, those in the health profession, they'd be happy with mask mandates continuing indefinitely. The object is not to snuff out all disease, because if everyone just sheltered in place indefinitely, then yeah, we wouldn't have communicable disease, but that's not possible. That's no way to live.
Right.
That's not desirable or feasible. But the question is, what's our threshold to say that we're done? And, right now, the way I put it is that we're sort of 10 yards short of the finish line, which I think is an accurate way to put it. We're very close. And whether that's a matter of weeks or months, we're seeing our case numbers decline very rapidly. Again, we talked about that percent positivity, which is 10% or even single digits at this point. I think we're right there. I think a prudent thing would be to wait maybe a few weeks or a month, but certainly not more than that at this point.
All right. This person, look, I always, we say in journalism, there's no such thing as a stupid question, and we have to be respectful of everybody. People don't understand something that's novel, and this is a novel virus that for the last 2 years we've dealt with. And so this person's asking the question about Lysol. Does spraying Lysol remove it from the air? And it's a question that we should probably ask you. This person wants to know.
Not from the air, from surfaces, certainly. But the main way that this thing is transmitted is both droplets. So that's sort of, the small particles of moisture that come out of your mouth when you're talking, shouting, singing, anything, just breathing. And then also aerosols, which are the very small particles that cling into the air. So, spraying Lysol, it might have some effect in terms of reducing that sort of viral burden in the air, but honestly, I wouldn't trust that spraying Lysol into the air is going to necessarily disinfect it. If you really want to be on the safe side, if you're concerned about it, ventilation is the way to go. So if there's a good HVAC system in the building that you're talking about, and then certainly being outside where you have a lot of air moving through, that's the best way to decontaminate the air.
So you have the mask mandates being relaxed, and so you have people going to the stores now, running in, grabbing something, and running out. I mean, should they be really concerned if they're not wearing a mask and they're just running in and they're not really talking to anyone, and they're just running to the self checkout aisle and they're coming back and they're saying, "All right, I'm done." I mean, is that how easy it is to catch still, would you say?
It actually is. It actually is. And I was just reading about how our our Surgeon General actually tested positive for COVID. And this is an individual that you can assume has been taking all the appropriate precautions. I've had many people at the hospital, for instance, who have told me I've done everything right. I wore my mask. I had minimal contact with anyone else. Still managed to get the virus. So it's all luck of the draw. I make the analogy of a seatbelt. So, if you're driving and you have your seatbelt on, you're protected. If you take your seatbelt off for a minute or even a few seconds, yeah, the chances are nothing bad's going to happen. But if you happen to be in an accident during that moment, something terrible could be the result. So it's kind of the same with a mask. It's a per incident risk. If you run into the store and you're not wearing one, is it particularly high risk if there's no one else in there and it's a well-ventilated place? Yeah, it's a low risk. But if you think about the burden of wearing a mask and how quickly it takes to, put the mask on, take the mask off, it's a small burden to bear and a small price to pay for the protection of even shielding you from that small exposure. So personally, I still wear my N95 to Costco, if that answers it. But I would say even running in to the store, it's not necessarily the duration of exposure. It's just all odds.
But I know for a while we were saying 15 minutes, 6 feet, within 6 feet, 15 minutes. And you're saying now the duration isn't necessarily as critical. It's just a matter of being exposed.
Yes. So, the longer the duration, the more risk you're going to have, because obviously the more of these viral particles it's going to take. And it's not just like one viral particle hits you, you're infected. There's a certain number that you need to be exposed to in order to really have it gain a foothold and make an infection. So the idea is that the longer the exposure, the more chance you are to develop a symptomatic infection. But again, that's all just playing the odds. So it's very possible you could come into contact with one person who's got Omicron. They breathe out, you breathe in, you've got it, and that could be seconds. Or conversely, I've seen people who have been in situations where they've been around people who have been infected, they didn't get sick. But again, if you're playing the odds, any exposure is still exposure. The longer that is, the more likely you are to develop that symptomatic infection.
All right, we have Chelsea here on YouTube saying this looks basically like the flu. You stay being cautious while people who aren't afraid continue to live their lives. This is something we hear often from people, and we'd like to say this is just a health story. This is a political story. This is a personal freedom story. This is a lot. There's a lot loaded in this. And this person says, look, it's darn near the flu. First of all, is that true right now in terms of numbers and caseload and danger?
Well, no. I mean, that's unfortunately that's objectively wrong. It's not the flu, and we have 900,000 plus people that are dead, over the last couple of years that are proof that it's not the flu. So there's been no flu strain. In the U.S., you look at the 1918 flu that created that many deaths, but typically we look at something like 30 to 60,000 flu deaths per year. So the idea that since March 2020 we've had over 900,000, it's not the flu. Omicron, for instance, we were having something like 2,500 people a day dying. That's not the flu. So, despite what people might think, and they're not seeing the sick patients because they all go to the hospital. We see them. So, somebody says, okay, well, they got COVID, they went to the hospital. They don't see what that looks like. They don't see what it looks like for these people over the course of weeks, to die. It's a very terrible thing. So we've compartmentalized it, and unfortunately, in the community, people aren't very aware of how bad it really is. If you take a look at the numbers, again, it speaks for itself. Just the sheer number of people that are in the hospital and have died, that's not influenza. Now, if it gets to the point where we're not seeing those hospitalizations, we're not seeing those deaths, if we're still testing people and they come up positive for a coronavirus, which a lot of them are just cold viruses, then yeah, I agree. Why should we care? It's not reasonable to shut down a classroom or shut down a workplace if one person tests positive for a coronavirus, which is no more deadly than a cold. That doesn't make sense. But at the same time, just objectively, you can't say that it's to the point where it's just a cold or the flu.
Now, would you say that we're heading in that direction relative to the fact that it's not what it was, of course, a few months ago, a few weeks ago, and it seems to be, as you had pointed out at the beginning, getting a little bit better in terms of the hospital loads that you're seeing and the death rate? I mean, the positivity rate is lower. At what point does it go all the way to, like, what's the number? What's the magic number for you, Dr. Skrzynski, to say, look, we're at a place where it's safe to go out without a mask and it's safe to be as you were before this all started?
That's a tricky question, and I'll certainly do my best to answer that. So, take the flu for instance. Influenza is something that we lived with for many, many years, and let's discount the last flu pandemic. But let's just say, well, every year we accept that something like 20, 30, 50,000 people are going to die of influenza every year. And this becomes very transactional, which I really don't like, because you're saying, well, the cost of doing business, the cost of just people circulating the community, some people are going to die of communicable disease. And that's been true since the dawn of humanity. There's really not much you can do about it. But putting numbers on it gets kind of weird.
Sure.
I would think that, as a society, we've accepted these flu deaths, for instance. We don't get bent out of shape because 60,000 people a year die of influenza. I think, as sort of, grim as it is to just say, well, if we're under a certain number of deaths, but at the same time, just in the general sense of things, I think that if we really do see that trend in COVID towards decreased virulence, which Omicron does represent, again, the reason why we had these big mortality numbers is just because there were so many cases, but it is less virulent. Now, if that trend continues and we do see COVID sort of slink back into being a cold virus, then yeah, I think that if it falls under that threshold of mortality for, let's say, influenza, then I think we could say, well, we will live with that because we definitely accepted that before in other circumstances.
I appreciate your compassion and your care and you not wanting to look at this just from a transactional level, as you said. I mean, these are people that you see and saw, sadly, that are no longer with us in your own COVID ward in your hospital that you've been dealing with. I mean, while the rest of us go about our daily lives and talk about what our opinion is about this stuff, you're looking at the raw numbers and you're looking at actual people in the hospital, and that emotionally has been hard on all of you. Isn't that safe to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the key things is that COVID care has been compartmentalized. And a lot of people want to point to the very low mortality rate and say, well, it's, if you crunch the numbers in Michigan, for instance, if you just take the number of deaths divided by the number of cases, the most recent number you'd come up with something like 1.4% mortality. And it's actually probably even less than that, because you got to remember there's a lot of cases that are undiagnosed. So that's just based on the numbers. And people might say, well, it's 1% mortality. Why should we care? It's because 1% is enormous when you think about the actual numbers of that. And it was enough to fill up our hospital. And for those who lost a loved one, it's a very simple story to say, well, they got sick, they went to the hospital, they died. But the actual path that many of our COVID patients take is very bad. It's terrible. And for those of us who've been taking care of them, it's very fresh every day for us what this disease looks like. So, for somebody to say, well, it's not that bad, these are things I see with my own eyes.
Yeah.
So I would definitely beg to differ.
Well, I did have this question. 3 different people pointed out this study from Johns Hopkins University revealing that their study said that COVID lockdowns prevented only a small number of deaths caused by the virus. I know lockdowns become a political issue, and Dr. Skrzynski, I want to appreciate your boundaries here with what you're here to talk about. But what have you noticed relative to those lockdowns and where they how they've helped or how they haven't?
Well, first a comment about that study. So that one you have to take with a grain of salt because first off, that was done by an individual who graduated from Johns Hopkins. Currently, he's an economist employed in an independent think tank. So this is not
Mm,
some large institutional study that was done.
sure.
This is somebody's individual compilation of all the data. And there's a lot of problems with that. I'd encourage anybody to actually look at the methodology of that one and take it apart themselves and ask if it was done fairly. But I will say that, my own personal experience, you do see uh, you definitely see a difference in the caseload depending on social activity. That just makes sense. There's a one of the things is a huge seasonal component to this thing. So if you look at the surges that we had, winter, spring, colder months for sure, but we do see a correlation between when people are getting together, when the guidelines and such were relaxed, we do see upticks in cases. So I can't, give you the statistics from
Sure.
Beaumont and say, well, this is the exact correlation. But I can tell you, at least in my own experience, you definitely do see a benefit from lockdowns. And there's also a lot of data out there in individual studies that do show lockdowns have great benefit. If you look at this, so-called Hopkins study, it's a meta-analysis, meaning that they took data from many studies, put them together. Unfortunately, they were very selective in terms of which studies they chose, and they actually omitted a lot of data from large studies that show that lockdowns actually do have a benefit.
Interesting. We have another person here, Eric Buckner. Eric is saying, do you think masks should still be optional for anyone who wants to wear them moving forward? And obviously the answer is anyone who wants to wear a mask. People for years have been wearing masks on planes because they feel like it's maybe cleaner and safer. So obviously there's no one's going to stop you. But I guess the question that Eric's asking is, as a doctor, what are your recommendations? Let's say positivity rate goes down to 3%. And there's some people who say, I'm going to keep wearing a mask. As a doctor, what would you tell that person?
I would say absolutely. If you want to wear a mask, wear the mask. Personally, I'll continue to wear masks in a lot of situations as well. That's not to say that people are going to wear them 100% of the time. Obviously, especially social situations, wearing a mask to a bar, it just doesn't really jive. But, certainly in other crowded situations, again, it's a per episode risk. So if you're going into a situation where you might be exposed to anything, not just COVID, but anything, that mask is going to reduce your risk. I think one of the important things is as we look nationally, for instance, places that had legitimate mask mandates, just because mandates are ending doesn't mean there is now a mandate against masks. So I think that the mask should be optional. And also moving forward, that's a societal issue we're going to have to deal with. Is we're
Yeah.
going to have to all put down the guns and come to a reconciliation with each other, because if you're at the store and you're wearing a mask and someone else is not, you can't point to that person and say, well, you're irresponsible, you're not doing your part, when they're saying, well, no one's telling me I need to do it anymore. And vice versa, they can't look at the person with the mask and saying, well, you're living in fear. Both of those are untrue. And so I think that moving forward, as we have these recommendations go away, as in other parts of the country we have these mandates go away, it's got to be destigmatized from both sides. But anyone who wants to wear a mask moving forward, absolutely go ahead. We saw a big downturn in all sorts of respiratory viruses because of things like masking. So they do work. And if you want to wear one, absolutely.
I find it interesting because years ago, I'm not a big winter coat guy. I don't like wearing the huge, puffy, crazy winter coats, and people love them and people like them. And I always joke with people that I think it's a protest to winter. And people wear ridiculous things. I mean, these hats that are like crazy with all these bells and whistles on their hats. I'm like, what are you doing? And I have this kind of tendency, when I'm walking around to be like, why is that person wearing that hat? It's like 61 degrees outside and they're wearing this winter hat like it's so cold. And then ultimately I have to decide in my head, like, dude, who are you to tell someone else how to dress? And I guess that includes a mask too. If someone else decides to bundle up and you decide that the temperature isn't right to bundle up, you wouldn't walk up to someone and say, why the hell are you wearing that winter coat? So then maybe we should just leave people alone. I think that's kind of what it comes down to, the personal freedom, right?
Yeah, very well said. I think that's a perfect analogy. I mean, you wouldn't mock that person, say, "Oh, are you afraid of the cold? Why are you wearing so much clothing?" But it's the same thing. It's masks definitely they do their job. They definitely work. But I think that it just gets to a bigger issue of kindness. We so often now the first instinct is towards anger and towards confrontation. I think a lot of people are sort of looking for that moment when they can righteously yell at somebody else. And so, if you see somebody again who's not wearing a mask or wearing the mask, if the recommendations for that are gone, then that just does become an actual personal choice. And just like the person that's going to wear a heavy coat on a 60-degree day, maybe that's how they're most comfortable. Maybe that's how they're going to have the best day and have the best experience, and they feel best that way. And the same thing for the person wearing the mask.
I hope my neighbor Michael doesn't mind me pointing this out, but he was out shoveling the snow the other day, and he was wearing a mask while he was shoveling. And he's a pretty cool guy. He's pretty open-minded. And I just looked at him as a joke and said, Michael, you really don't need to wear that mask while you're shoveling the snow outside. And he says, hey, it keeps me warm. So it's like, dude, do what you got to do, right? I mean, it's your body, your
Yeah.
mouth, your face. Hey, had a question here from Travis, and I like his question here, and I do wonder. Okay, I understand that there are rules and that people want to try to be as safe as they can, but Travis asked a really good question. He said, "What about the people who go to restaurants?" And I'm sorry, his message just flew away. I can't find it on the list because we're getting so many questions. But the question that he basically asked is, how does the virus know that when you walk into a restaurant, it shouldn't attack you until you sit down to take your mask off and start eating? I thought that was a great question. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because it does seem, I'm sorry, it seems a little ridiculous to walk into a restaurant and while I walk by 5 tables, I'm going to wear a mask and then I'm going to take it off for 2.5 hours, laugh, yell, have a great time with another couple, and then put the mask back on to walk out. Kind of bizarre, don't you think?
It is, and I think what you're looking at is a situation where it's a best effort. Again, it's a per incident risk. It's a cumulative. It's the amount of time that you're exposed correlates with the possibility that you might be infected. So I agree. I'm certainly not going to disagree. I think that's an excellent point. I've had the same thought. It's when I'm standing. The virus is at eye level, but it's not at seat
Right.
level. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make
Sure.
sense. Especially because we know that these aerosols build up. Droplets can spread further than 6 feet. There is a lot of risk to just being there in that room. So honestly, I think what we're looking at is a best effort, and I think it's under the circumstances, it's people saying, well, what's the compromise we can give? And even if it might be lip service, I think it comes with good intent. It's the idea of how do we maximize the safety of this situation while still allowing us to not only the businesses where these people need to keep their employees working. There's a lot of livelihoods that are at stake
Sure.
in the service industry, a huge number of livelihoods. Plus, socially, it's a really important part of life. So I think it's a best effort. No, I don't think that it makes too terribly much sense. Is it can give you some risk mitigation if you're up and moving while wearing the mask? Yeah. Is that going to make a difference compared to the couple hours you're sitting without the mask? Probably not.
Sure. No, that's a good point. And I was just curious to know what you thought about that. You brought up a good point about personal freedom, and I think we're seeing an argument unfold on the chat on this YouTube channel of people saying, if you want to be a lab rat, be a lab rat and go take these vaccines. The other person is saying, well, if you want to go do this, go do that. And there is a lot of anger out there in this world. When you look at science and you look at the numbers that you see at Beaumont in our community, how are you able to then, when you go out in the community as an ambassador, really kind of frame this virus the right way every step of the way? And in asking that question, I ask you also, doesn't it continuously change this conversation?
It absolutely changes, and it changes day by day, sometimes multiple times per day. And in the healthcare industry, we're just people. You better believe that at the end of the day, we want to have the same experiences that everyone else does. We have the same wishes, desires, hopes, dreams, everything. It's in the medical field. I think there's this idea that it's sort of these lockstep marching robots, and we're just going to say whatever the CDC writes down. That's what's going to come out of our mouths. There's a lot of differing opinions on what all this means. And if you go to the hospital, the people I work with, very educated, very talented, very exceptional people, and there's a million different viewpoints. As many people as there are at that hospital, there's that many different viewpoints on what's going on. So I think that it's difficult because from our standpoint, we can definitely see what works. If you look at what's going on at the hospital, and this is not even just looking at the hospital from a numbers standpoint, this is my own experience, is that the vaccines work. They work. I've never seen someone in the hospital for a vaccine-related complication, whereas I've taken care of dozens and dozens of people who are unvaccinated who get super sick from COVID. So, it's just such a weird split situation where on the one hand, we see the science, we see the things firsthand, we know what the data means, we can interpret that. On the other hand, we want to leave the hospital, we want to be normal people, we want to have real conversations with our friends and family. It's been a very, very weird 2 years for me, I'll tell you that much.
I'm sure it has been. I mean, if it's been weird for everybody else, someone who's literally spent their every waking moment in, that they're working in that COVID ward, it's been tough for you all. And we just want to say thank you for the work that you've done over the course of the last few years. It's been incredible to try to deal with this. I wanted to ask you about the mask situation. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Cloth mask versus K95, N95. There's all these different masks out there. One person here points out on our chat, hey, doctors used to wear cloth masks. Dentists wore cloth masks for all these years. Is it still good? I mean, can someone wear a cloth mask and be okay?
Yeah. I mean, the cloth mask is going to prevent, a lot of those droplets, and especially in terms of transmission. So you think about your dentist or your surgeon wearing that type of mask. I mean, he's, either right up in a surgical wound or right there in your face. The whole idea is that, not only is that going to prevent any sort of droplets and particles from hitting him, that's going to prevent anything that he's breathing out from hitting you. So that's going to work. You got to imagine though that with a cloth mask or a surgical mask, now we use it, the surgical masks are made of much better material than a cloth mask would be. But there's a lot of gaps. So if you think about sort of around the sides of the mouth, there's a lot of gaps for airflow. And the concern is not necessarily the droplets. So that's, again, what's going to be sort of expelled directly from your mouth. The concern is these aerosol particles, these smaller particles. So could you breathe them in through the sides of the mask? Could you breathe them out through the sides of the mask? Yeah. That's why things like the KN95s are going to be a better choice, because it's a better material, but more importantly, it's going to seal better on the face, and it's going to prevent that airflow around the mask. If you look at N95s, that's what we use in the hospital to treat our COVID patients. That's the best quality material. That's the best quality seal. However, you got to make sure that it actually fits correctly, and that takes a little bit of skill to use.
Yeah, no, for sure. When you hear people say, we had a couple people here on our YouTube channel saying, that masks just don't work. When you hear masks don't work, when you hear those words, as a medical professional, regardless of looking at this particular, virus, which has been heavily politicized, when you take a look at the virus from a scientific level and transmission, and you think about masks, can you say with full confidence, based on all the studies, that masks do work?
Yes, absolutely. Masks do work. On a basic science level, they work. For a while, people were talking about how the virus was too small, and that it would sort of go between the fibers of the mask, and that's not true. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on, like electrostatic forces, and there's a lot of things that happen that cause that filtration effect. But also, if you look at the population studies, if you look at area, you can go online, go on PubMed, it's free to everybody. And you can look at the studies yourself, and you can see how these epidemiology studies, so it's not just basic science stuff, this is actually looking at real people in the real world, and do they get sick or not? Do they transmit or not with mask use? And the answer is masks actually work. If you look at things like Omicron, which is, many, many times more contagious than the original COVID, they don't work as well, but they still work. I've been walking into COVID rooms wearing an N95 for 2 years now, and to my knowledge, I've never gotten COVID. So, they do something. Whether is it the silver bullet that we hope, where if everyone masks, this goes away instantly? No, but is it a potent tool that we have? Absolutely.
All right. Well, I tell you what, you've been really helpful in answering all these questions, and we want to say thank you. But if there's anything else you'd like to say, things that you hear on the street, on the internet, things that you want to just address, I want to give you the last word here to have the opportunity to do so.
Well, sure, I appreciate that. And first off, I just wanted to thank you for having me. I mean, it's always a pleasure to be on, and we're really appreciative for forums like this to try and have good conversations. And I think that's probably the note I'd want to leave everyone on is have a conversation, please, please. Don't argue, don't shout, don't yell, don't accuse. Have the conversation. And if you have a viewpoint which differs from the mainstream or differs from the dogma, do your research, back that up, make a coherent argument, and then present that. And then if you're with good people, they will do the same, and they'll come back at you with counterpoints, and that becomes a discussion. Because right now, as a society, we're facing a lot of very grave issues, and whichever ones are the popular ones or the most urgent ones for our listeners right now, it's going to vary dramatically. But in many ways, there's a lot of things that we got to address in the coming years, and the fallout from COVID is going to be one of them. And if we can continue talking, continue having good quality civil conversations, we're going to get through it. 100% we're going to get through it.
Well, that's a good point. I often say that, I would never walk into a Ford factory or a General Motors factory and tell someone how to make a car and try to pretend like I understand how engineers are doing their job or factory workers are doing theirs. And I know doctors, you have a lot of moving parts and pieces that we don't always see and understand, and we try to make sense of our world like everybody else. But we thank you for helping make sense of it by joining us today. We hope we can do this again with you, Dr. Skrzynski, in the coming weeks.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
All right. Well, it's good to see you. And if you like this video, everyone at home, just go ahead and hit share, and we'll make sure that we get the word out. Of course, we'll see you tonight on Fox 2 News at 5. Dr. Skrzynski, and to all your friends at Beaumont, thanks for your help today.
My pleasure. Thank you.